Hello, welcome to Wyvern Minis. I'm back on the Tyranids this week and building up a few extra leapers and a Neurolictor for my Combat Patrol, because I'm going to be playing a game tomorrow using the Combat Patrol in White Dwarf 497, which was given to you for free if you bought the magazine. Combat Patrol using the Vanguard Organisms from the Tyranid Codex. Now I think there's probably quite a lot of cynics out there who'll say, oh, Games Workshop only gave you the rules for free so they can sell more leapers. Well, you know, maybe. But I choose to believe the best in people and think, thanks very much for giving us some free rules to play some more cool games. I think it's particularly cool because I really like the Vanguard Organisms and the Vanguard Detachment, but I really struggle to use it in the main 40k game in bigger battles. There's some really clever little tricks you can do. You can score lots of points and objectives, but in terms of killing stuff, just forget about it. These alpha predator bugs are surprisingly naff at killing things, which is a bit of a surprise. Unless they go up against like really squishy kind of infantry. So I've had a lot of games where I've been ahead on points because I've been able to leap between objectives and all that kind of stuff and sneak around, which is great, but then the whole army gets wiped off the board. Which isn't really much fun. So my hope is with Combat Patrol, you've got fewer units, you've got fewer vehicles, and maybe this is where they shine. And narratively, it makes a huge amount of sense because, you know, in theory, these organisms are supposed to be ranging ahead of the Tyranid high fleets, sowing the seeds of terror and getting everything ready for the main forces to move in. So being a smaller Combat Patrol kind of makes more narrative sense and might be more fun as well. So the Combat Patrol is made up of one Lictor, one Neurolictor, and 3 squads of 3 Leapers. I've got 3 Leapers already from the Leviathan box set. I've got Lictors coming out my ears because I've converted a Lictor in the past. I've got one of the old metal ones and I've got one of the new ones. So I'm covered on a single Lictor for this. And also I bought a Neurolictor, but I hadn't assembled it yet, so I'm going to assemble it in this video. But I needed 2 more squads of Leapers. So in this video I'm just going to go over the 2 squads of Leapers and assembling the Neurolictor. I'll paint them in the next one. Unfortunately I have to play this game with unpainted models, and that's the way it goes sometimes, but I'll get them painted up soon. But I wanted to make sure that my Leapers were distinguishable from one another, so I'll talk about that later on. I've got 1 extra squad of plastic Leapers, and I'm going to do something to make them look a little bit different to the ones I've already got. And then I've got some 3D printed ones that I've acquired. So let's get into it. I got the files from Puppetswar through my mini factory, and that's where I get most of my STLs from. There are a few other websites to use. I won't scroll down because you'll see the secret tribe codes, which are not allowed. So I'm part of their tribe, which means I get a discount on the stuff. They've got various collections of different types of armies. The orcs, this is where I first got to know them really, was buying stuff physically from them before they started doing STLs and all that. They've got some really interesting orc models, so that's something I'm definitely going to revisit in a future video. You know, bits and pieces like Ghostbusters and Batman and whatever, pretty cool. Strikers is their equivalent of Space Marines. They've tried to make them look a little bit different to Space Marines to, I guess, avoid a lawsuit, but I mean, they're pretty similar. But the thing we're looking at here is Bugs, the Tyranids. They've gone for a slightly different aesthetic. They're just a little bit tweaked, I think, again, to avoid being too similar to Games Workshop, but they are Games Workshop replacement. That's what they're doing. The brain bugs, I think, are really quite cool. These are to replace Neurogaunt's. I think the Neurogaunt models are quite like them, but they look quite similar to Termagants, and I don't know. I like the idea of these. But the sneaky bugs I saw, and I thought, great, I could get these to be Von Ryan's Leapers and look quite different. But they could be Leapers, they could be Lictors. I mean, it's hard to tell really. They look a bit like both. The fact that they've now brought out these sneaky brain bugs, which are clearly Neurolictors, makes me think that actually they intended the other ones to be Lictors rather than Leapers. But, you know, I think they work as either, depending on how big you print them out. Leapers just look like little Lictors, really. few slight differences, but you can see here one of the nice things that they do, which I think is quite cool, is have these sort of helmets on some of the bugs, which looks a bit like some kind of control mechanism or something, which I think is quite interesting. But here it said 40mm round base, so I thought, great, that would be a good leaper. But in hindsight, 90mm tall, that's a bit big, so had to be resized. But yeah, really nice sort of selection of models from Puppetswar. So to compare the size of the lictors and leapers, you can see here the lictor on a 50mm base is a little bit bigger and bulky, a bit taller, a bit more mean than a leaper. The file I printed out from Puppetswar comes in definitely a bit more bulky than a leaper. You can see here it's difficult to get a real good comparison because they're both hunched over. It's difficult to hold them up to the camera. But it's a bit bulkier than that. It's very similar in height to a lictor, a little bit more thick and bulky, I suppose. So anyway, I went back to the old drawing board and the slicing software, put the files back in again and rescaled them to be 75% size. Meant I could fit 2 complete leapers onto the build plate, along with a few other bits and pieces of detritus, which I'm going to talk about later. Something I thought I'll print some things off that I can use on the bases. And then the third one I did here separately with a few dead Elysians that I'd picked up from somewhere, and a dead orc just in case, you know. Again, a few more bits and pieces, just making use of the print time to get a few bits of scattered terrain printed out at the same time, which can go on the bases and make them look cool. But yeah, 75% size seemed to be about right for rescaling these Puppetswar sneaky bugs to be leapers. So if you do buy them from Puppetswar, that's what I'd recommend doing. So the same file came out looking like this. A little bit smaller, much smaller than a lictor, about the same size as a leaper. And I think, yeah, that's a much more sensible sort of size to have. And when you compare them on the bases, you know, that big print on a 40mm base, it overhangs a lot. It really wants to look better sitting on a 50mm base. And they actually supplied a 50mm base with the files, so I think the graphic they had was wrong. But the one that I've rescaled sits on the 40mm base just nicely. But yeah, looking from above is actually quite good to see the sort of overall footprint of the models, and you can see where the lictor, I mean the Games Workshop lictor, really sticks out from the 50mm base quite a lot because of those big claws. But yeah, these printouts look just right, I think, as they are there. So when it comes to assembling these, they're 3D printed resin, so you've got to use super glue rather than plastic glue. And they're really well done, actually. It's quite subtle, but they've got little tiny pegs in there, not quite like the push fit things that you get in Games Workshop starter sets, not remotely that obvious. But the bits go in quite nicely. I was expecting to have to do some pinning on these to make sure that the upper claws were staying in place, but it wasn't necessary at all. Just a bit of super glue, put them in place, and there you go. I decided for the bases on these not to do anything too elaborate. I was going to do something more on the ones that are coming later. So I just stuck them on the 40mm bases that I had, and just put some dead Elysians on the bases. So I kind of thought that would tie these 3 together. So these 3 leapers will look different to the plastic leapers because they are different models. So that's quite a nice thing. Even if I paint them in the same colour scheme, you're still going to be able to tell that they are a distinct unit compared to the normal Games Workshop ones. But tying them together with having similar corpses on their bases, I think is just quite a nice little thing to make them look a bit more cohesive. And then I'll do the bases in the same way that I've done my other bases for the Tyranids, with kind of sand and nice neon tufts and all that kind of stuff. So they should look really cool when they're painted up. And when I assembled the larger print that I had done, it became blindingly obvious that this was supposed to be a lictor. I mean, they've very much copied the GW pose with that one. Yeah, I think they're intended to be lictors, but making them smaller and turning them into leapers, it's not a problem because they're my models. Do what I want, and that's the whole thing really about the hobby. Just you should be able to do what you want, and it's all about being a bit creative. Anyway, I gave the big lictor, printed out lictor, to one of my mates down at the club. I think he had one of the old metal lictors in his army, and always good to have another one. So I didn't need it, so I gave it over to him. And I continued on building the 3 printed leapers that I'd made, and they came out looking pretty cool. So I got these sprues of leapers from eBay, from somebody who split a Leviathan box. You can obviously buy the leapers individually from Games Workshop now. I decided I didn't need to buy a whole nother Leviathan box. I was tempted because I quite wanted another Screaming Killer and another Psychophage, but I resisted. Because I quite like being married, and that probably would have ended that quite quickly if I'd have gone buying more Leviathan boxes. Yeah, I got these off eBay. It was quite cheap actually to get the sprue of the leapers. But I wanted to do something a bit different with them. So stick them together with plastic glue, just as normal. And they're relatively easy to put together because they're push-fit models. It is worth having the instructions, but they're numbered sequentially, so sort of number 1 to 9 are all the bits you need for the first leaper, for example. So it's quite easy to put together. But I wanted to do something a little bit different. So I think for armies like Tyranids, if you've got multiple units, then you need some way to distinguish them. If you've got Space Marines or Imperial Guard, you can use squad markings or insignia, and you can make it kind of obvious, this is squad number 1, this is squad number 2. You can use transfers or whatever to make it obvious what they are, because during the game you might end up with units being next to each other, or maybe they'll get in the same combat, or it can get a bit confusing. And I think it's good for you when you're playing the game, and good for your opponent, to be able to know which squad is which. When it comes to something like Tyranids, aside from the fact that other players will have no idea what most of the models are because they all just look like bugs, and they certainly won't know what the weapons are. I don't think I know what all the weapons are because they're not very obvious. But if you've got different squads, you're painting them all in the same High Fleet colours, it can be very easy to get confused during the course of a game. I suppose there are a few ways you could address that. You could say that you paint things all in different colours. You could have a multitude of different coloured units, which is a valid way to go. I think if you think about Lizardmen in Warhammer Fantasy and in Age of Sigmar, I've seen people do that with their Lizardmen, do different scale colours so you can tell the difference. And I think that will work with Tyranids, but I personally think it will look better to have a consistent High Fleet colour, so it's just like a big sea of bugs coming towards you. But if you've got a big sea of bugs coming towards you, how do you know which ones are in which unit if they happen to be next to each other? Could do a little bit of markings on them, maybe a different colour head crest or some stripes or something on their back. That's a possibility. But I figured here what I would try and do is use something on the bases to make it obvious which ones are different. So for these ones, I printed out some various bits of battlefield debris and ruins and that kind of stuff, and I thought I'll make them actually leap over these bits of terrain and do what they say on the tin. It's supposed to be leapers, so make them either leap over it or emerging from behind it or sneaking over it or whatever. So they're sneaking up on their prey, and that will mean that I could paint them in exactly the same way as the first squad of leapers I had, and you'll still be able to tell the difference because the bases will be quite obviously different. It all comes down to your preferences, how you want to play the game and how you want to do your hobby. Some people want to make wonderful pieces of art and don't worry about how it works in the game. Some people want to make it so they're essentially they're just gaming pieces. They're not models for any aesthetic purpose, they're just for gaming with. And in that case, you could just spray paint this model green and that model yellow, and then you know which one's which. Any approach is perfectly valid. You do what you want because it's your hobby. For me, I wanted to have the consistent look as much as possible, but be able to distinguish them. So that's why I got the Puppetswar sneaky bugs, because they are a different sculpt. So I can paint them in the same black and red colours, and it'll be quite obvious that they are not the same leapers as the other squads. And then these ones, they're going to have different bases, so it's going to be quite clear. I think that, to me, strikes a nice balance between making them look cool and making them usable in the game. And also, I really like the making them jump over these bits of terrain and that. I think it actually looked really cool. Yeah, that's what I did. For my termagants, I tried painting the guns in slightly different colours. So I thought that would be quite a nice subtle way to be able to distinguish the two squads of termagants, but then have them not be so different that they can't be mixed together into one big squad. I think the colours I chose were a bit too similar, to be honest. They're quite difficult to tell the difference from a distance, so it didn't work quite as well as I was hoping it was going to. But I think the principle was sound, and that's something I'm going to try on some of the other models in the future. I've got a few ideas for doing gene stealers and stuff like that, and perhaps doing gene stealers in a completely different colour, or at least some gene stealers. Perhaps doing them in a different colour that matches closer to my gene stealer cults that I got, because then that will represent the fact that the gene stealers were already there on the planet when the Hive Fleet came in and invaded. So I think trying to tie a bit of narrative element through to how you paint it and how you play with it, I think that's pretty cool. And that balance of narrative versus gameplay is kind of what I particularly like about the hobby. I like playing games and the challenge of playing a game against an opponent, trying to win, but not being beardy about it, not being overly competitive. It's about just having fun, and also telling a good story. And that's what I like. So if you can tell the story through the miniatures as well, that's great. So that's why I use these 3D printed bits of wall. I was expecting to have to pin the models onto them because I didn't think they'd sit very well, but I actually found that with a little bit of repositioning of the various talons, I could actually get the leapers coming over and sort of looking like they were pulling themselves over the wall or just running past it, and had enough contact points that just a bit of super glue allowed me to stick them on, which was a lot easier than pinning everything. But I've done videos before where I showed a bit of pinning, and it's a obviously really useful thing to do to limit the contact points you have. But this is the sort of thing I like to do. I've done similar things with flying models as well. I've got a couple of beholders here which are floating. I'm not a particular fan of clear flying bases, just because when you spray paint a model, if you spray varnish it, the clear plastic goes all cloudy, and you've got to mask it all off, and it's just a bit of a pain. At the end of the day, it still looks like a big bit of clear plastic sticking up their arse. So I'd rather do something that hides that in a sort of clever way. So making the beholders look like they're floating in front of some pillars, I thought was a good way of doing that. And they definitely needed pinning to achieve that. With the leapers, you're getting them to look like they're jumping and leaping over these walls, but just by having the contact points that allow the super glue to stick them in place. And they're nice and solid, and because they're plastic, it doesn't matter that they're leaning over because they're not going to fall. So yeah, I was really happy with how those came out. When it came to assembling the Neurolictor, I didn't do anything fancy with it. I just stuck it together as per the instructions and put a dead guardsman on the base. I'm quite favouring the dead guardsman on these bases because I think it will provide a nice colour contrast. If I do them with maybe green fatigues or something, that will look quite good against the sandy bases, and also against the neon tufts and all that kind of stuff. So I think that'll stand out quite nicely. I mean, blue ultramarines would also look good, but they're fairly ubiquitous nowadays. Everyone likes a dead ultramarine. So I thought something a bit different. And with the lictors, I was doing a bit of imagining that the lictors had snuck behind enemy lines and taken out a sort of dump, a silo, a fuel dump or something. So the guardsmen are there looking after the stores, because you wouldn't waste a Space Marine's time guarding some stores, would you? He's got to be out front killing things. So anyway, very pleased with how they came together, nice and quick and easy, and I was able to play the game when it came to it on the club day. So the game, this video has taken me long enough to edit that I now have actually played the game after starting the video before the game. And it was really good, really enjoyed it. I was right in my suspicion that the Combat Patrol would work really nicely with these Vanguard Onslaught bugs. It was against Thousand Suns, And so my opponent Tom had the Thousand Suns Combat Patrol, had some Zangor Beastmen thingies, which just got blended to pieces by the Leapers, which was a bit shocking for him how easily, when he charged in, I had fights first on the Leapers, and the Leapers just killed 8 out of the 10 in one go. So that was a bit of a surprise. And he had some Terminators, and I knew the Terminators were going to be a tough nut to crack for the bugs. But again, I guess playing to the points really worked in my favour, because I was able to infiltrate everything forwards. I could get in combat with him in his deployment zone, keep him back, and then had enough bodies to be able to jump around between the objectives. So I was able to hold on to the objectives, even though we were playing a scenario that you needed a character to secure a couple of the objectives in no man's land. And I had no characters, because they're all just Tyranid bugs. And none of them have the character keyword, which is a surprise. But despite that, I was still able to get ahead on points. But the killing the Terminators was hard. That was quite a slugfest for a while in the middle, and I lost quite a few Leapers to that. Eventually lost the Lictor, but I did manage to eventually wear them down and take them out. He used Deep Strike on his Sorcerer, who was the leader. My secondary objective was to kill the leader as quickly as possible, so he kept him out of harm's way. I think in hindsight, Tom probably would have brought the leader in earlier, because he had this amazing magical flamethrower which just toasted the Tyranids. It was really a really horrible weapon against my units. They've got stealth, so you get -1 to hit them, but then when you've got an auto-hitting flamer, that makes the stealth irrelevant. You can't hide from the flames. So perhaps if he brought that guy on from the beginning of the battle, it would have gone differently. But it was a close fought game. At the end, he had just his Sorcerer left, and I think I had 1 Leaper. So there was just the 2 models left on the table at the end of it. I won on points, quite significantly on points, but I think there was a couple of times when I had a very lucky saving roll where I saved every single hit that he got onto me, saved them all on a 4+, and only had 1 wound remaining. So that was very lucky. He had some good luck with his sorceress abilities to keep his leader alive. So it was a really nice game where it felt like we both had a good chance of winning, and it could have gone either way. The end points didn't look like that, because I had sort of 40 points to his 13, I think, something like that. But yeah, it was good, and playing against Tom's always nice, because he's a really nice opponent. He just wants to kind of have fun and not be too overly competitive about it or anything like that. Yeah, it was worthwhile. So I would highly recommend doing a combat patrol with the new combat patrol out of White Dwarf. I think it works really nicely, and I think combat patrol as a system is good. I think they've balanced it quite nicely. I've not had any bad games of it. You've got a smaller number of units to worry about. It's a lot easier to finish the game, quickly. We only have a few hours in the morning when we hire the hall. So if you play a 2,000 point game of 40k, you ain't going to finish. You might get 3 or 4 turns, maybe. But there's too many models to actually finish the game. So you can finish a game of combat patrol, and it feels good. You have to really focus on the objectives and really think about your points, and every single model counts. So yeah, I think it was a big success. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I will be getting some paint on these very soon, because I want to play some more games of combat patrol using these. I might well try playing another couple of big games of 40k, although I think next time I've got a few big monsters, so I'm gonna probably change the detachment I use next time I do a big game of 40k with the Tyranids. Use something a bit more balanced, and just have a few Vanguard Organisms to support, rather than focus on the Vanguard, because like I say, it doesn't work very well. But anyway, we'll see. like and subscribe to the video, and look down below for some links and all that. I'll put some links to various bits and pieces, so check out the description, and thanks for watching, and I will see you on the next one. Cheers, bye.